Okay, so tonight we begin a four-part series in which I'll be examining beliefs and rituals related to death as expressed and experienced in the world's great religions, including Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shinto, Mormonism, and Baha'i faith. So by the time this is over, you're going to know a lot about death. Or at least how religions have approached. Yeah. Death and taxes, yes. The one thing, Christy Van Kiersburg always kids me. He says, "You like to talk about death?" I said, "Well, it's something that everyone is going to do." And how many? Don probably knows this because he heard this on Sunday. How many people do they figure have died in the history of mankind? How many people have died? In all history. In the history, well, since our species. 100 billion. So, well, if my son said to me, well, if 100 billion people have done it, I can probably do it. Yeah. So in any case, so tonight we're going to begin with Zoroastrianism and Judaism. How many people know anything about Zoroastrianism? I've mentioned it a few times in passing, but we're going to go over it again. So we'll start with Zoroastrianism. And the reason we're going to do that is a lot of scholars believe that many of the ideas that about death that came into the Semitic religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, may well have originated with the Zoroastrians. And that is because of, do you remember this, the Babylonian captivity, which took place in 587 BCE. This is when the Babylonians conquered Judah and took the leading Jews to Babylon. It was a captivity. And they lived there for about 50 years. So it was at least one generation, and they picked up a lot of the idea. If you go in a culture for 50 years, and you're going to be very much impacted by the ideas surrounding you. So it's believed that a lot of the ideas, especially regarding death and evil and the devil and Satan, came out of Zoroastrianism as picked up by these Jews who then later were allowed to come back when the Persians conquered Babylon. So it was about a 50-year period where they had contact. So again, imagine yourself going somewhere for 50 years and ask yourself, how much would you be impacted by living in a different culture for 50 years. So it was a religion that's supposed to be started by this gentleman named Zoroaster. Dates somewhere between 7th, 9th century BCE. According to the tradition, as a young man, he was trained for the priesthood in what was the dominant religion of the time, which was polytheistic, lots of different gods. And he became a priest in that tradition about the age of 15. He gained knowledge from teachers. He traveled a lot of experiences. But then at the age of 30, which is an interesting age for a lot of religious teachers, at the age of 30, he experienced a revelation, which he claims, during a special festival. On the bank of a river, he saw a shining being who revealed himself as Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. So he had a revelation. Along with, and there were some other angelic figures. Zoroaster soon became aware of the existence of two primal spirits. Ahura Mazda, the good spirit, and Ahriman, the destructive spirit. Can you get from the images? Yeah. Thus he decided to spend his life teaching people to seek and serve Ahura Mazda. Okay? So there's a dualism here, good and evil. Over time he claimed to have received further revelations where he saw a vision of 7 angels. His teachings were eventually collected in a book known as the Zend Avesta. This would be the equivalent of the Hebrew Bible to Jews, to the New Testament for Christians, to the Quran for Muslims. It's called the Zend Avesta. And the religion of Zoroastrianism developed out of his teachings. And like I said, it was centered around the idea that the entire cosmos, history, and individuals were in a constant conflict between good and evil. There are two forces that are at work in the cosmos, good and evil. This actually is, the evil is generally seen as this sort of, scaled creature of some sort. And of course, Ahura Mazda is represented as the good. So, the material world was seen as being afflicted with the evils of death. So death is seen as a type of evil. It's evil because it's dominated or afflicted by the evil spirit. That's matter, okay? The physical world. The presence was, and the reason that happened, according to the tradition, is Ahura Mazda didn't want the entire cosmos to be infected by evil, so he gave evil this domain, the material world. The material world. So this is the domain of Ahriman, into which Ahura Mazda and his forces will not enter. The good forces won't enter the material world. They enter only the spiritual world. And each individual is seen to be a combination of body and spirit. Body is essentially evil in the sense that it dies. It decays. It rots. And that was seen to be an example of this evil force in the world. But the evil force can't touch the spirit. So do you see where you get this dualism? And this is sometimes thought where in later both Judaic and Christian thought, the idea of soul and matter, soul and body, distinction. Which one tends to be better in those traditions? Yeah, the body, until recently, the body was pretty much seen as, in this light, it was a tomb. It was a tomb. Your spirit was in that tomb, but eventually the spirit would leave that tomb. I mean, that's the whole theme of resurrection. So this was very strongly held in Zoroastrian thought. So when a person dies and the spirit leaves the body, Ahriman, they rush into the body and contaminate it. So a dead body is contaminated in Zoroastrian thought. It's impure. You might know, if you've ever been around a body that's been lying around for a while, it becomes sort of seen as contaminated. So following the death of a believer, the body is cleansed. First of all, you got to clean the body as best you can. Traditionally, it was given a ritual bath. Now, this is interesting, in water and bull's urine. Bull's urine. Yeah. I don't know why. It must have had there must be a reason, but it was seen to be some sort of purification. Maybe it was like an antiseptic, I don't know, of some sort. Then there's this interesting thing. In traditional communities, a dog was brought before the corpse. And there was a ritual known as the gazing of the dog. The dog would be brought in front because dogs were believed to scare away demons. And this gaze helped purify the body for its disposal. So there was a hall prepared in the mortuary for those who wished to pay their respects. 2 priests would conduct the ritual. Prayers, incense, final respects. So an official ceremony for the departure of the dead. And then before the dead is deceased, it was dressed in this body wrap called a kusti, a white cotton wrap. The eldest son or daughter would be traditionally the one to do the wrapping. could be done by any family member, but generally, and you find often the oldest son in most of these traditions takes on this role. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting for people. The body was not buried. It was not cremated. It was not put in the water. What's left? You just leave it open to the elements, mainly to vultures, wild dogs, etc. And that was done in a place called the Tower of Silence. The body would be taken up here. I'm going to show you in just a moment one that has a few bodies on the outside. If you don't want to look, don't look. But I think it's important to know if you want to know anything about Zoroastrian tradition. So the question becomes why? Chris?
Well, they believe that the elements of water and fire and earth were sacred.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to put something decaying.
Yeah, did everyone hear that? In Zoroastrianism, the land, the ground, the earth is sacred. Fire is sacred. Water is sacred. You don't want to do what? Contaminate them with a dead body. So you leave the body. And after all, from this religious point of view, the body is just a what? It's just a container. The spirit has been taken up, the body, and it's left open in these towers of silence. By the way, I should have said, Zoroastrianism was in the middle, was in Babylon, what we call the Middle East today, Iran, Iraq. But after the Muslim conquest, most of the Zoroastrians fled to India. Fled to India. So the largest Zoroastrian communities, they're known as Parsees. Have you ever heard of the Parsees? Parsi is Farsi, like in Persian. They live most of them in Mumbai. And they have the Tower of Silence up on a very wealthy part called Malabar Hill, but they can't use it anymore for health reasons. What was happening, the vultures would pick at the body and fly away, and as they flew away, they would drop parts. So modernity is caught up with this a bit, but still in some places in Iran you will use this. So this is, I'll show this slide just shortly if you don't want to look, but that's how it is. The bodies are on the outside of that circle, and it's left open to vultures, wild dogs, etc., who pick them clean, and then all you're left with are the bones. And then the family is supposed to take the bones, crush them, and bury them in a vault. Okay. The bones are seen as somewhat cleaner than, or pure than the body. The bones are identified with the earth. That's why you can bury the bones. These are called Towers of Silence, and like I said, in Mumbai, this is no longer practiced, but it's become a problem for the Parsi. I mean, if that's your tradition,
what do they do then?
They're starting to bury them. I was just reading an article, they're being required to bury, but there's been a bit of an uproar from the Parsi community, but they're a minority, and so they don't necessarily have that much impact. Yeah, Chris?
And India is so crowded with people, you'd think, well, couldn't they take it to an open area or something? That is very difficult.
Yeah, and like I said, this Tower of Silences was in a very, very wealthy area of Mumbai, up on a hill called Malabar Hill. A few acres away, there are great mansions, one of the largest mansions in the world, owned by an Indian industrialist with 300 rooms or something. And he didn't like body parts falling in his... And if you're... in any case, so this is an issue. But if that's a strong religious belief, that causes a problem. Let me give you another example. My parents, when they were in India, knew a Parsi family very well. And one of their relatives died in a plane crash, and the body was burned. Now, we would say, oh, that's because it was burned. But what they were upset about is this violated their tradition. And according to my parents, this caused them grief for quite a while. That we would grieve for perhaps another reason. But the fact that the body had contaminated fire. And if you go to Zoroastrian temples, they don't have images, they have fire. There's a big fire pot in the middle of their temples. So they sometimes called fire worshippers. But the fire is the symbol of Ahura Mazda, because it's light. Fire brings light. Okay, so after a few days, there'll be a prayer vigil, usually at a home, remembering departed loved ones. There's a prayer table. I don't know if you can see it there. There's a picture of Zoroaster. There will often be a picture of the departed, candle, prayer books, photographs for the departed. And this takes place for several weeks afterwards. These continue after funeral vigils. During the day, one should pray facing the sun, because you're facing the light, and at night, facing a lighted object. So the idea of fire and light in Zoroastrian religion is a very powerful symbol. So here's a suggested prayer, so you get the idea. We venerate the souls of righteous men and women, of those we know. Zoroaster is the first and the best in the divine doctrine. We venerate the life, conscience, perception, soul, and conviction of the righteous men and women who have acquired the teachings of Zoroaster for the sake of righteousness. We venerate the righteous men and women of the primal principles who realized their own souls, who acquired all that is good. We venerate the souls of the righteous persons born in whatever land, and of men and women whose religious convictions are gaining, have gained, or shall gain goodness in the future. Thus we venerate good men and women, eternally, ever gaining, ever growing, all men and women who live the life of a good mind. So there's this emphasis that there's the dark side and the good side. It's in the cosmos, it's in history, and it's within you. And this is the notion. And I think you can probably see some similarities in both Judaism and Christianity. And it's felt that this religion, which is a minority religion today by a long shot, may have been the source of many of these ideas. So, it's not over yet. The soul has left. The body's doing what bodies do. So, now there's the account of the soul's journey. After death, the soul makes a journey. And that journey is the soul's initially filled with anxiety, but then it's helped by an angel, Mithra. So you have a guardian angel that will guide you on your journey. And they're going to something called, and then there's an angel of conscience. So there's Mithra, who then Mithra takes you a certain distance, hands you off to the angel of conscience. So where are you going? You're going to a bridge. You're going to what is known as the CHINAVAT bridge, or the bridge of judgment. Judgment. Bridge of judgment. Where the dead soul's life is reviewed. There's a life review. There's a life review. We see this a lot in what they call NDEs, near-death experiences, if you've ever read about those. People who have technically died, heart stops sometimes, but they claim to have experiences and then they're brought back. One of the common elements is a life review. Everything sort of just quickly passes before you. You got to see who you are. So this is and then the scripture describes a bridge like a beam of many sides. Some of its edges are broad, and some are thin and razor sharp. When the souls of the righteous and wicked arrive at the bridge, they turn to that side which is suitable to their necessities. So if you have been righteous, the bridge is pretty wide. If you haven't been quite so righteous, it narrows and narrows and narrows. And if you've been evil, it's like a razor's edge. So when the righteous pass over the bridge, the path becomes pleasant, gold-colored spring, scented blossoms. The angel leads you to the house of song. Nice journey. But when the wicked walk across it, it becomes thorny, foul-smelling, agonizing, leading to the house of lies. The house of song and the house of lies. A heaven and a hell. Good souls are led to paradise, and evil souls to the world of punishment. Souls will remain in their respective abodes till the end of the current cycle of time. Paradise is, like I said, a pleasant place, radiance, comforts. Hell is a dark world where souls are subjected to intense agony by the creatures of Ahriman, or we call the devil, I guess, who takes great delight in suffering. Here's a description from one of the holy books. Heaven is lofty, exalted, supreme, most brilliant, most fragrant, most pure, filled with beautiful existences, most desirable and most good, which is the place and abode of the sacred beings, where is found all comfort, pleasure, joy, happiness, welfare, better even than the greatest and most supreme welfare and pleasures found in this world. There is no want, pain, distress, or discomfort, and it is pleasantness complete. It is the constantly beneficial place, full of unending space, a good and boundless world. Hell is deep and descending, dark, stinking, filled with wretched existences, with the most bad cave of demons and fiends. In it there is no comfort, pleasantness, or joy, just stench, filth, pain, distress, and discomfort. There the sinful soul is punished by the wicked demons and darkness, the head of whom is Ahriman, the deadly. However, in the tradition, hell is never eternal. That's the good side. It's not eternal. It is considered temporary and reformative. You are experiencing this, essentially, you are experiencing the suffering that you have caused. And that becomes a purifying fire. You pass through that fire, and then, so that's one of the things about Zoroastrianism. It sounds pretty awful, and it is. And most of these images are meant to sort of scare you and keep you on the right path, but at least it's not eternal in the Zoroastrian tradition. It's temporary and reformative. That's important. You're going through this because if it was eternal, who would win? Ahriman. If it was eternal, Ahriman would win. It's not eternal because Ahura Mazda is 51% and Ahriman is 49%. There's just a little more good in the cosmos than evil. There's also, over time, there developed an intermediary place called Misvav Nagatu, which is a kind of purgatory. So if the bridge, the wide bridge, okay, the narrow, but there is the middle. And so you're going to probably experience a little pain. You're going to see some of the things you've done, but it's sort of a purgatory. And that's also thought to have influenced later Christian doctrine of purgatory, especially the Catholic Church. But at the end of time, there will be a savior figure who arrives. He's known as Saoshyant. It's interesting. He will be born to a virgin, impregnated by the seed of Zoroaster, while bathing in a lake. And he will usher in the end of time and the complete victory of good. In the end, Ahura Mazda's forces win. So this is the Zoroastrian cosmos. At the end of time, the good will win, and all those who have been in hell will be brought out, and all will be saved. All. Because again, if that's not the case, Ahriman wins. He would have someone for eternity that Ahura Mazda created out of goodness. That can't happen in Zoroastrian thought. Okay, so that's Zoroastrian. Any questions, thoughts at this point? Anything that's confusing?
Well, that end part reminds me of Sunday's sermon, and the discussion includes about at the end all will be well.
All will be well. All will be well in the end. And if it isn't well, it isn't the end. That's how it is. Yes, Dave.
Now, you really study all these different religions. They're so much similar, and there's just a little difference. But we all look at the differences rather than the similarities.
Yeah.
And we have wars where we fight, we all kill people just because there's a little difference and a whole bunch of similarity to them. Why can't people figure this out? Say, hey, we're all right, how do we get along?
I'm trying to help. But, that's true. Hopefully we'll figure it out. All right, so let's now move to ancient Judaism. Death emerges as a central issue in the early section of Genesis. God, or Yahweh, has created the world and found it good, right? If you know the Genesis. That's the refrain. Found it good. But Adam and Eve disobey, and that brings death into the world. Here's the passage. Because, they've disobeyed and they've tried to hide, and God finds them. Because you listen to your wife. We can bypass that. And ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground. Since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So that's from the Jewish myth or story, how death comes into the world. And then God gets kind of upset at even having created man. Genesis 6. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race. I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. And that's when you get the great flood. And there's Noah and his family who is saved, and it's a restart. A lot of people forget this part. Mankind's bad. I'm getting rid of them. Okay? So, again, you see the notion here that there's a lot of thought about evil. And any religion has to deal with evil because it's a major problem for most people. So, the rest of Genesis in the following scripture is then the story of God's repair and restoration of his people, Israel. The people as a whole. Individuals die in the early Judaic thought. There's no idea of life after death, or if there is, it's very shady, as we shall see. Continuity is found in the nation and in one's family and children. That's what continues. Israel lives as a people. The closest idea to some sort of form of life after death in early Judaism, we're talking now, when I say early Judaism, before the Roman influence, and we'll get to that, a place called Sheol, S-H-E-O-L. It appears as early as Genesis, but you mainly find it in the Psalms and some of the other wisdom books. It's a very shadowy domain beneath the earth, comparable to the Mesopotamian underworld or the Greek Hades. Everything's sort of like shadows and shades. It's not really something that's solid. We don't want to confuse this with later ideas of hell that develop. This is just sort of a shadowy place where everyone goes. When you die, this is your your spirit or your ghost is in this shadowy place. And it's to be avoided as long as possible. Thus in Psalm 6:4, we see, "Come back, Yahweh, rescue my soul. Save me if you love me. For in death there is no remembrance of you. Who can sing your praises in Sheol?" So there's this notion of a sort of murky underlife, but nothing really concrete. It's thought that at death the body returns to dust and the breath, or the ruach, returns to God. But it's not the individual. The individual dies. There's nothing that can survive except memory of the deceased by the living. That's what carries on in early Jewish thought, basically. This is reflected in early burial practices and mourning rites, which sought to celebrate the life of the individual, well, what we call a memorial. Right? A memorial. Remember them, and this is what you will take with you. Ancient Jewish practices concerning the dead instructed that the individual be buried and not cremated. Jews do not cremate. Cremation was associated with foreign practices. People surrounding the Jews often cremated. This was seen not a practice to be followed. Burial, on the other hand, represented a connection between the individual and God. Okay? God has created the earth. So that's the connection. According to Jewish law, burial of the deceased had to occur within 24 hours. This was due to ritual purity. Again, because after 24 hours, a body starts to really decay, so you want to, yeah. And remember, they didn't have all these, although the Egyptians had embalming, the Jews didn't use embalming. Okay? They didn't embalm the body. They put it in the ground as soon as they could. It was washed and anointed with oils and spices. It was wrapped in a unique linen, carried to a cemetery in a procession of lamentation and grief. The burial was required to take place outside the village where the individual lived, and often there were family tombs. This notion of the community is extremely important in Jewish history. The people. The people. This is what has allowed Judaism to survive, even though it's such a small percentage, if you look at the world population. In this country, I think there's 2% of the country is Jewish. You probably wouldn't know that by the impact, but that's all, 2%. There's a very strong sense of community, tradition, which has kept them able to survive through a lot of persecution. Burial was followed by a grieving period that lasted from 3 to 7 days, and I'll say a little bit more about that in the contemporary world momentarily. Okay, so that was basically the idea till about the time of the Roman conquest, or a little bit before, when certain elements within Judaism began expressing beliefs in the possibility of life after death. Now, what's interesting is the origins of why this happened are kind of obscure. We really don't know. There are some different suggestions. Some biblical scholars say it was a natural progression within the tradition. Over time, the idea of this breath or spirit came to be identified with a soul, and that soul was somehow separate, and that's what lasted. Others say contact with Zoroastrianism, where we see what happened, the journey of the soul after death, may have been influenced during the Babylonian captivity. Others see Greek influences, where the Greeks always believed in a dualism. There was a body and the soul. Socrates is always talking about the soul, Plato about the soul. So all these came together, and for some reason, a number of people within the tradition began to think there's something after death besides this shell. And the other question, it became a moral issue. The moral question was this: if there's nothing after, and the good live a good life, and are oftentimes not given much result on this planet, and the evil often get away with all sorts of things, how is that moral? Is that fair? Is that justice? So this becomes one of the dominant arguments for, and is continued right through Western philosophy, that the idea, what the powerful argument for life after death is the need for justice. This world is not just. Look around. Therefore, if God is just and the world isn't just, so the idea began there's an afterlife where there will be some sort of justice. And we saw that in the Zoroastrian tradition, right? That's what it's all about. You're rewarded or you're punished according to what you've done, with the end being good, but you have to go through this process of justice. And there was a very important historical event that probably brought this about. It was called the Maccabean Revolt. This was a revolt of an armed rebellion by the Maccabees, who were a group of Jewish warriors, against the ruling Seleucid Empire of the time. These were a Greek empire, just before the Romans. The main phase of the revolt was 167 to 160 BCE, and the Maccabees actually drove the Seleucids out for a period of time. But in so doing, there were a lot of martyrs. So the question became, these individuals who've given up their lives, sacrificed their lives to free Israel, for what? Well, the old answer would be, because you freed Israel. But here was the notion that somehow these people who had sacrificed, given their lives, should have some sort of reward. And this is something very long-standing in Judaism from this time, later in Christianity and Islam, the idea of the martyr. The one who sacrifices his or her life for the religion. And this was tied into the idea there should be some form of life after death. So, the question arose theologically, if God could create people in the first place out of nothing, why couldn't he recreate them? Okay. Recreate. That's what resurrection is about. Recreation. What made that impossible? And certain thinkers, mainly amongst the Pharisees, began to argue strongly, no, this is what the truth is. And then they would go back to the old scriptures, try and find reasons for their argument in the old scriptures. You can generally find reasons for your arguments in scriptures if you look. And this started to become a more dominant, although there was a split. The Sadducees, these were the temple priests. These are the ones, when you read about Jesus, these are the ones who brought him to trial. They're the head of the temple. They kept the old tradition. There's nothing after death except the people, the nation. The Pharisees, many of them, and many of these were what we might call progressive theologians of their time, started to argue for the idea of a life after death. And by the time of Jesus, it was quite a well thought of idea. So Judaism was undergoing change theologically. There was this idea of life after death. And what are known as those who believed in the apocalypse, like John the Baptist. They were saying the end was coming, and what was going to happen when the end came? The good would be taken up, and the evil would be left behind. Okay, so this notion has crept in. But there's a major theological disagreement, as there usually is between theologians, whether it was a soul that survived or a resurrected body. What lasts? What's interesting about this is if you ask most people today, they'll say, my soul will go on to heaven. The original Apostles' Creed says it's a resurrected body, which will happen at the end of time. So this argument starts very early on, just before the time of Jesus. Some argue for the body being resurrected. Some argue for there being a soul. By the 6th century, now we're moving, just to give you an idea, by the 6th century, after the Jews have dispersed, the temple's been destroyed for centuries. By the 6th century, the most prominent position was post-death existence was resurrection of the body. So 7th century Judaism, the strongest idea, the soul argument was tending to be pushed aside, and the idea of resurrection of the body. In fact, this was Philo argued for the soul. Maimonides, who's one of the great Jewish thinkers of medieval period, he's 1135 to 1204. He said, anyone who did not believe in the resurrection of the dead was not an adherent of Judaism. So this, for a number of centuries, this position looked like it was going to win out. However, over time, ideas related to the soul as existing became more prominent, especially as we got into modernity. And we know science, etc. The body resurrected, it was just too hard for people to believe, for a lot of people. How does a body get resurrected when it disappears and spreads out? In fact, I probably have some of the atoms in my body that were at one time part of Napoleon. Yeah. Let's think of it. What happens when the body dies, the atoms, and they're consumed and they spread? How do you resurrect that? That was, so the idea of the soul as existing. And plus then there are the mystic teachings of the Kabbalah. These were the Jewish mystics who argued that there is a soul which not only survives after death, reincarnated. Most people don't think of Judaism in reincarnation, but the Kabbalah mystics often thought of it as reincarnation. And they actually believed in a type of karma. The karma being from the Hindu notion of cause and effect. What you've done, there will be results, and you have to live out that karma in future lives until you're finally fit to leave it all. So this comes from one of their books. This is from the Jewish Kabbalah Zohar. The souls must re-enter the absolute from whence they have emerged. So they go back into the absolute. But to accomplish this end, they must develop perfections, the germ of which is planted in them. So you have the perfect light in you. If they have not developed these traits in this life, then they must commence another life, and a third, and a fourth, and so on. They must go on like this until they acquire the condition that allows them to associate again with God. This is a very minority position. It's the mystics. It was never really accepted into traditional doctrine. But it's important to know this. Many of the Jewish mystics believed in reincarnation. Still, a man by the name of John Boker has written a book called The Meanings of Death. It's a very interesting, if you're interested in this topic in general, because it covers all these religions and talks about the meanings. He said that Jews have overall remained generally cautious, at least modern Jews, and reticent in their own personal beliefs regarding post-mortem existence. They don't emphasize it. I play golf with Rabbi Mike. Does anyone know Rabbi Mike Lochter? Yeah, and I've asked him about this. He says, oh, it may be. There may be something afterwards. I'm concerned with what's good now. Let's do some good now. And then whatever happens, happens. So a lot of, and he's a Reform Jew, but there doesn't tend to be an overemphasis on this. The emphasis is on doing what is good, what is right, what is just. This idea, and also, there's nothing more important than a good name. A good name. This comes actually from the 3rd century by a rabbi. The end of man is to die, and the end of a beast is to be slaughtered. And all are doomed to die. Happy is he who was brought up in the Torah, and whose labor was in the Torah, and who has given pleasure to his Creator, and who grew up with a good name, and departed the world with a good name. Of him Solomon has said, a good name is better than precious oil. The day of death better than the day of one's birth. So to die with a good name, to be remembered by your people. That tends to be, for most of the Jews that I have known, and mostly, I must admit, are Reformed Jews, that tends to be their focus. And there may be something afterwards, and you can find scriptures to support it, but that's not seen as ultimately significant. Okay, there are a few important practices, how we do it, okay, that take place before the service occurs. So, the funeral service. If the deceased man was a man, the body is washed by a male. If it's a female, the body is washed by a female. After the body is washed, it is dressed in this simple shroud. Jewish funerals happen, like we said, very quickly. One day is more than one day is considered a problem. They're not left alone during that time. The body is to be guarded around the clock until after burial. A family member or someone who has been appointed by the funeral parlor will guard and watch over the body. So there's someone sitting with the body until it is buried. A traditional funeral is simple and really quite brief. Before the funeral starts, the family members will tear their own garments to symbolize a loss of a loved one. In a Reform Jewish funeral, the rabbi leading the service will tear black ribbons and hand them to family members. The rabbi in the service, he'll read from the Psalms. There'll be a eulogy, a memorial prayer known as the Maleh RACHAMIM, which reads as follows. O God, full of compassion, who dwells on high, grant true rest upon the wings of the Shenikah, the divine presence, in the exalted spheres of the holy and pure, who shine as the resplendence of the firmament, to the soul of who has gone to his supernal world. For charity has been donated in remembrance of his soul. May his place of rest be Gan Eden. Therefore, may the all-merciful one shelter him with the cover of his wings forever, and bind his soul in the bond of life. The Lord is his heritage. May he rest in his resting place in peace. And let us all say, Amen. So that will be read. That's a definite, there'll be other readings, but that's a traditional scripture, prayer that's read at death. After the readings are finished, the male family members will carry or wheel the casket out of the room, generally accompanied by the reading of the 23rd Psalm. Once everyone is at the cemetery, more prayers take place. Participating family members place dirt on top of the casket before it is buried. Then there is something called Shiva, or sitting. This is a mourning period for the family. And you go through this after death. It generally used to last 7 days, not 7, but 7 days where people would come, not 7 days continuous, and you're not staying up 7 days straight. But for 7 days, friends and family would come every day or afternoon and sit, and associate, but it's sort of a mourning period. Reform has cut it down to 3, and sometimes modern 1. Yeah, modernity wants to get, there's this, we don't like things that aren't instant somehow. 7 days? Can't you do it in 3? Well, how about 1? So in any case, and at that time, what is known as the mourner's KADISH, which is a famous prayer, is said for 30 days after a spouse, child, or sibling has been buried. The main theme of the Kaddish is the magnification and sanctification of God's name. It unites memory of the deceased with the greatness of God. It includes the following words. This is just part of it. May his great name be blessed forever and to all eternity. It's not the dead person. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored, adored and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Oh, blessed be he beyond all the blessings and hymns and praises and consolations that are ever spoken in the world. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and for all of Israel. He who creates peace in his celestial heights, may he create peace for us and for all Israel, and say, Amen. What's interesting about that, it doesn't say anything about the individual. The focus is on the greatness of God. Additionally, it's recited on the anniversary of the death and at memorial services. Okay, finally, just a few words about this book, which I think Reverend Albert talked about, the book of Ecclesiastes, which written probably about 250 BCE, called part of the wisdom literature tradition. You remember we had that series on the wisdom literature, which included Job. Some people have wondered how this got in the Bible. It's considered the most heretical book. And it's because its picture of the world is very realistic. Good doesn't necessarily win in Ecclesiastes. It's for the fate of the sons of man and the fate of the beasts is the same. As one dies, so does the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts. For all is vanity. That's a famous phrase from Ecclesiastes. All is vanity. The book declares the dead are probably more fortunate than the living, and he who has not been born, the most fortunate of all. I raise this issue because it shows you the breadth of any religious tradition. You can have this book in Holy Scripture and then have other books which are much different. And that is usually the sign of a mature religious tradition. It covers a wide scope of thought and concern. Because I'm sure people at times feel this. When things look really down and out and there's a lot of suffering. And if you just go say, oh, it'll be okay in the end. You know, they might do what? They might kick you. There's a time and place for everything. That comes from Ecclesiastes. There's a time to mourn. There's a time to doubt. There's a time to believe. And in this case, this puts a little bit of balance on it. Okay, next week we're going to be looking at Christianity and Islam, and you'll see some. Reverend Albert isn't involved in this series. He needs a break. He's had a pretty busy few weeks, so he's taken some time off from this, not from everything, but from these classes. So I'll be teaching all of these, and then there'll be after that. Then we'll get back together for our tag team match. But So the other thing that's interesting when you think about death, you'll never experience it. I mean, by definition, you can't experience it. You will experience other people's deaths, and you may project that, but you can't experience death because if you experience it, you're not dead. Right. So anyway, thanks for coming out, and we'll see you next week.